Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of John William Anderson and the murder of Elizabeth Anderson in Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1875. It is quite a long story, but I hope that you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this story, then please do give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. There are very few details about the early life of either John or Elizabeth. John was born in Gateshead in around 1843. He was born into what was described at the time as a middle-class family, and he was well educated, able to both read and write. It was said that he had previously been a soldier and had more recently been a clerk for a chemical broker, but he had been out of work for a few weeks at the time of the murder. It was said in one newspaper article that since losing his last job he had been drinking a lot. However, it was said before this he had had a good character, leading a respectable life, and that drinking was a recent thing, not something he had done all of his life. Elizabeth was born in around 1845 in Cumberland to parents Ashley and Elizabeth Walker. Her father, Ashley, was said to be a stonemason. Unlike John, Elizabeth could neither read nor write, as when the couple had married in around 1866, she had been unable to sign the marriage certificate. John and Elizabeth had 2 children together, both boys. At the time the crime was committed, only one of the boys was living with them. The elder, who I believe was called George, was said to be living in London. It was said in one article that he was living with John's father, although in another article it was said that he was living with John's mother. But there is no reason given as to why he's not living with his parents. The younger son, Robert, was living with them in Mitford Street in Newcastle. In 1871 they had been living with Elizabeth's parents, but they had later moved into their own home, still in Mitford Street, where they also had a small shop. Although in most newspaper reports it stated that this is Elizabeth's shop and that John doesn't seem to take much of an interest in it. The shop that they had was in one room at the front of the building, and they had their living area in the room at the back of the building. They don't really seem to have had a happy marriage. They may have been happy at first, but it is stated that now, most of the time, all they do is argue and fight. Ashley, Elizabeth's father, said that she did not drink, but the neighbours seemed to think that she did. Some seemed to think that the couple were as bad as each other, while others believed that John was the drinker and the one who caused the arguments and the fights. On August the 28th, 1875, John and Elizabeth spent the early evening with their neighbours, Bridget and Benjamin Danskin. Benjamin was apparently an old army friend of John's. They returned to their own home at around 9:30 p.m, where John planned to help Elizabeth to shut the shop up before returning to their friend's house. However, it was said that they then began to argue, and John closed the bottom half of the door to the shop, which was a kind of stable door, and this was the outer door, and this meant that Elizabeth could not get out and their son Richard could not get in. It was suggested that then Elizabeth had hit John, as he was heard to shout, "If you hit me, I will stab you." And after this, Elizabeth had picked up a bacon knife and a fight had begun. John had apparently grabbed the knife from her, and in a frenzied attack he stabbed her several times. Their son Richard saw most of this from just outside the shop door, and he also heard his mother's piercing screams. There were a lot of terraced houses in Newcastle at the time, and Mitford Street was very close to Tyneside Terrace. The two faced each other, so neighbours in both of these streets could easily see and hear what was going on in that area. The screams from Elizabeth had quickly drawn a crowd of neighbours to their door from both of these streets. Sarah Dodds was one of these neighbours, and as John unlocked the door and came outside, she took hold of him by the shoulder and said, "You villain, what have you done?" And he replied by saying, "I have finished her." And he then walked away from her and headed up the street. The neighbours then entered the house and the shop, where they found Elizabeth on the floor in a pool of blood. John Anderson had left the shop and headed to Laurel Street Police Station in Newcastle. Inside he found PC Dixon and Sergeant Kennedy. He showed them his hand, which was bleeding from a large cut on the palm. Sergeant Kennedy asked him who had done this, and he replied, "I have got stabbed." Sergeant Kennedy repeated the same question, and this time John replied by saying, "I have committed a murder. I have stabbed my wife to death." Sergeant Kennedy then asked him where this crime had taken place, and John said, 61 Mitford Street. John was then locked in the cells at the police station, and both PC Dixon and Sergeant Kennedy went to Mitford Street, where they found Elizabeth and several of the neighbours inside the shop. The doctor was sent for, but by the time he arrived, Elizabeth was clearly already dead. John Anderson was then charged with the wilful murder of his wife. The inquest was held at Newcastle at either the Durham Ox Inn or the Cattle Market Inn in Clayton Street. I only saw one newspaper article about this, so for clarity there were 3 pubs close to each other on this part of the street: the Golden Fleece, the Cattle Market Inn and the Durham Ox Inn, and it seems that the newspaper at the time either wasn't sure which one had been used or had simply made a mistake with the name. At the inquest, Ashley Walker said he had identified the body found in Mitford Street as that of his daughter Elizabeth Anderson, and that she was 29 years old. He said that the couple had been unhappy for some time, and that John had been known to take things from the shop to sell to buy drink. Dr. May said that the cause of death for Elizabeth was severe stab wounds to the side and the chest. She had 7 stab wounds altogether, but 2 had been so violent that they had not only penetrated the heart, but had also broken her ribs and punctured her lung. He said that either of the 2 most vicious wounds would have been enough to kill her, and he felt that the whole attack must have been done with great force and great rage. Mrs. Dodds said she felt that Elizabeth was dead when they went inside the shop area of the house. However, Sergeant Kennedy, who arrived a short time later, said he felt that she was alive when he got there, as he thought she raised an arm and rolled her eyes. But there seems to be no conclusive proof of that, but it was because of his thoughts that Sergeant Kennedy immediately sent for a doctor, as no one else appeared to have done so. The evidence from John Anderson was the same as the information I have already given about the argument in the shop that fateful night that had led to him attacking his wife. The jury at the inquest very quickly returned a verdict of wilful murder against John Anderson, and he was committed for trial. The trial took place on the 1st of December at the Moot Hall in Newcastle. John Anderson was described at the time as being 32 years old, a nice-looking man with a military-style moustache and a sandy-coloured beard, and that he was smartly dressed, but his clothes appeared to be worn and faded. When asked how he pleaded, he firmly replied, "Not guilty." John and Elizabeth's son Robert, who was only around 7 years old at the time, did not give evidence at either the inquest or the trial, but he had been previously asked what he had seen. He said that he had seen his mum threaten his dad with a knife, and that his dad had taken it off her, and he thought that he had seen his dad stab his mum several times. It was thought that due to his age he may not remember things as clearly as an older child or an adult would, so that although this information was read out at the trial, it was said that what he had seen should not be taken as being completely correct. Both Bridget and Benjamin Danskin gave evidence. They mostly said very similar things with just one slight difference. Bridget said the couple had appeared to be in good spirits and on friendly terms when they were at their house. John had asked Elizabeth to go and get some beer, and Bridget said that Elizabeth had told him that she would once she had locked the shop up. However, Benjamin disagreed on this, and he claimed that she had actually said she would not get any for John, but that she would get some for Benjamin after she had locked the shop up. Bridget said she had known the couple for around 18 months and that to her they did not seem to be happy. She said they argued a lot and she mostly thought this was over money. Benjamin said he had known John since 1870 when they had served in the army together, and he also felt that the couple were not happy together. Both Benjamin and Bridget mentioned a lady by the name of Elizabeth Garrett, who had recently lived in the same area. They said that John had told his wife that he had seen her this day, and that his wife had said she was the woman that he should be with. However, they both said that she did not say it in anger, and no evidence was ever given that John had been having an affair. Both of them said that John and Elizabeth left together to go and close the shop, and that both Elizabeth and John had been drinking, but not to excess. Bridget and Benjamin also lived on Mitford Street in a home that joined the Anderson shop by means of a door between the two rooms, which they said the door was always locked. However, because of this door, they were able to hear quite well what was said that night. They said the couple had argued, but it was not clear what had started it. Elizabeth was shouting for John to let Robert in the house, and John was shouting that she would not go out that night. They heard the sound of someone being slapped, which they assumed was John, as he then yelled that if she hit him he would stab her. They then said they heard the sounds of a scuffle and then loud screams. And Benjamin and Bridget said that they immediately both went outside and went towards the shop. By the time they arrived, John had already left and was walking up the street away from the shop. Benjamin said he was the first inside, and he struck a match to make some light, and they then saw Elizabeth lying behind the shop counter, and Bridget said that she thought at this point in time she was still breathing. Ralph Taylor, who lived on Tyneside Terrace, had seen the crowd gathered outside the shop, and he had also been one of the first to go inside. He was the one to find the knife lying close to the body. He said he showed this to Mrs. Danskin, and he said that the blade was covered in blood. Mrs. Purdy said that she had seen Elizabeth and her son at around 9:30 p.m. on the night of the crime, sitting outside of their shop. She said John had been inside near the counter, and that Elizabeth had ran off down the street in the direction of a house where a Mrs. Hope lived. John had ran after her, and Mrs. Purdy said that he had then half carried and half dragged her back to the shop. But she said she didn't feel that Elizabeth was trying to resist being brought back in any way. She said they both then went inside the shop and John shut the door. She heard Elizabeth ask her to let her son in, and John came out, but Robert ran away, and she said that Robert was also crying. She continued to say that by now Isabella English and a lady named Elizabeth Anderson, who was no relation to John's wife of the same name, were also in the street, and John came out and asked them, "What are you listening at?" He then went back inside, and she said it was very soon after that that they all heard the screams coming from the shop. Both Elizabeth Anderson and Isabella English gave the same evidence as Mrs. Purdy, with Elizabeth adding that she had put her ear to the keyhole of the shop to try and hear what was being said. She said she also heard a slapping sound as described earlier by Benjamin and Bridget, and heard John threaten to stab his wife if she hit him, and she then also heard the dreadful screams. Both ladies had not been at the inquest, as they said no one had sent for them, but they had been called to the trial. A little tiny bit of confusion came from Mrs. Dodds, as she claimed to be the first inside the shop, followed by Ralph Taylor. However, Benjamin Danskin had also said that he was the first inside the shop, followed by his wife Bridget. It seems in the confusion that everyone seemed to remember being the first inside. Mrs. Dodds said that there was around a dozen people near the shop by the time the police arrived, some inside and some standing outside. Elizabeth's father Ashley said he had seen his daughter earlier that day on Scotswood Road, and they had walked down to her home together. He said that she seemed to be in good spirits and had not said anything to him about any problems that day with her husband. He said this was the last time he had seen her alive, and he said that although he had heard rumours that John had beaten, or as they said then, ill-used his wife, he did not think this was true, although he did know that John had taken to drink, and as he had previously said, they were not happy and often argued. He didn't think it had turned to any kind of violence. Sergeant Kennedy and Dr. May both gave similar evidence to what they had given at the inquest. Dr. May added that along with the 2 fatal stab wounds and 1 other to the front of her body, Elizabeth also had 4 stab wounds to her back. He felt the knife produced at the trial, described in some papers as a gully knife, was the right kind of knife to produce the wounds he had seen on the body of Elizabeth. A gully knife is a northern term used to describe a large knife, and it is a term that is often also used in Scotland. The defence hoped to put forward a case for manslaughter based on the grounds of provocation. They were trying to suggest that Elizabeth was a drunken, lazy and violent wife. However, it had previously been stated that John was living off his wife's earnings, so it was hard to prove that she was lazy, and it was said that although she could be quick-tempered and had perhaps provoked John on the night of the crime, it was never made clear that she had caused arguments on a frequent basis. And while most of the witnesses said that she did drink, most felt it was very little, unlike John, who they felt drank quite a lot. It was also stated that if a deadly weapon was used, then the provocation must be very great indeed to reduce the crime from murder to manslaughter, and this did not appear to be the case here. However, the defence still suggested to the jury that this case had indeed been one of great provocation. They said that Elizabeth had been the first to hit John and also threatened him first with the knife, and it was said that the attack should be viewed as something that had been done when John had completely lost control because of her actions that night. The jury retired to consider their verdict, and it would seem that they were struggling to agree. The foreman at one point returned to ask for paper and pens, but it would seem that this was not allowed. The judge asked what the issue was, and the foreman said they could not agree at all and asked the judge to clarify between aggravated manslaughter and willful murder, which he duly did, and the foreman went back to the jury to discuss the case further. At this point in time, the jury had to all be in agreement. There could be no situation where one did not agree with the rest, and this case was one where clearly several could not agree. After around 1.5 hours, the jury returned. The judge and the foreman discussed the issue of provocation, and the foreman of the jury said that they felt there was provocation and that John had intended to kill Elizabeth, but that it had not long been premeditated. They said they found him guilty, but with a strong recommendation to mercy. The judge asked did they mean to find him guilty of murder, and the foreman said yes. The judge then sentenced John Anderson to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the grounds of Newcastle prison. John Anderson was then taken from the dock and returned to prison to await his fate. As was the usual practice at the time, efforts were made in the form of letters and a petition to be sent to the Home Secretary to try and secure a reprieve for John. However, as was also often the case, this was rejected, and the hanging would go ahead as planned on the 22nd of December 1875. How John reacted to this news is not clear, but he had previously said that he did not wish to be saved, but if it was granted he would accept it, if only to spare the suffering of his mother and his children. The execution of John Anderson would be the first one to take place in private at Newcastle Prison, so it would be behind the walls and not outside in front of the usual crowds who would normally gather on these occasions. During his time in prison, John was visited daily by the prison chaplain, and it was said that he passed his time by reading books. He was said to be calm and resigned to his fate, and spent a lot of time telling people of his deep regret for the murder of his wife. It was said that he didn't appear to have any trouble sleeping or eating during the time that he spent in prison. He was visited on both the Saturday and the Monday before the execution by his mother. The visits referred to in those days were classed as interviews, and they were said to be of a very sad nature for his mother. I have not been able to find any details as to whether or not his 2 boys went to visit him, but perhaps they were seen as being too young to go, or he did not wish for them to see him in prison. On the day of the execution, it was said that huge crowds had gathered outside of the prison. Some people were said to have even climbed onto buildings close by in an attempt to see over the prison walls, but it is to be assumed that the scaffold would be placed in a position where it was not visible from any of these vantage points. The night before the execution, John went to sleep at around 9:45 p.m. It is not known if he slept well or not, but he got up the next morning at around 5:30 a.m. and washed and dressed, and was then attended by the prison chaplain. He is said to have said many times on that last morning how much he had loved his wife and how sorry he was for taking her life. The executioner was William Marwood, a man well known for using the measured drop form of execution, which he had introduced into the UK in around 1872, so this would be the one that was used for John Anderson. At a little before 8 a.m, Marwood went to John's cell where he was pinioned, which means his arms would be tied at the wrists, often using leather straps, and they then walked towards the scaffold. It was said that John walked calmly and firmly. The warders were at his side should they be needed, but he did not hesitate or stumble, and he stepped onto the drop without assistance. Marwood placed the white cap over his face, adjusted the rope, and stepped off the drop. He waited a moment before releasing the bolt, and John then fell. His death was said to be almost instantaneous, with just a few movements to his body before the rope finally became still. The black flag was raised, and the crowds outside the prison would now be aware that the punishment required by law had been duly carried out. After the usual time of 1 hour, his body was removed and placed into a plain wooden coffin, and he was later buried in the northeast corner of the prison alongside those who had gone before him. I'm sure many of you will have heard me talk of the felon's plot in All Saints Cemetery in other stories. John Anderson was one of the bodies removed when the prison was demolished in 1925, and he was buried in an unmarked mass grave, which later became known as the felon's plot. He was one of the lucky ones, as his body was found. 4 bodies of those buried inside the prison since 1844 were never found. John's 2 boys later went to live with an aunt, and they both appeared to still be living with her in 1911. Neither had married by this time. There are no further information about them or about the burial of their mother, Elizabeth. A little extra piece of information is that during the research of this story, I found an article which suggested that the jury at the trial had not actually been unanimous in their decision of guilty of willful murder. However, it seems that some confusion in the courtroom led to the judge assuming that the jury had indeed found John Anderson guilty of murder. But this article actually suggests that they may have not truly reached their decision at that point and required more time to think about it. So did the judge make a mistake, as this would have made a big difference to the ending of the story? But of course, whether this information is 100% true or not, I really can't say, but I did think that it was worth including. I hope you have found this sad and tragic story interesting. I would love to know your thoughts. Was there a miscarriage of justice? Did the jury really mean to find John guilty of manslaughter, or was his judgment correct? Whatever the outcome of that may or may not have been, it definitely is another sad case where someone lost their life because of alcohol and anger. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.